Hi there, my name is Will Patillo. This is the first in a four-part series on how to move, scale, and rotate the camera rig in VR. This is going to be focused on using the Vive, but I'll be making this in a way that it's easily generalizable to other consoles. Now, if you just want the functionality of moving the camera rig and you're not interested in going through all the tutorials and seeing all the details, a complete version of this project is available in a public repository on GitHub that I posted recently, and I will include a link to that repository in the description below this video. So let's get started. I created a starter project. Assume you already know how to do that. Just make sure to get rid of your main camera that Unity supplies when creating a new project, and go to the asset store, get SteamVR, that's this one here. Make sure to import it into your project, and then once you have it, go to prefabs, drop in the status and the camera rig. Set them at 0, 0, 0 for position, rotation, 1, 1, 1 for scale. Directional light's fine. And another thing that's optional is to create some visual reference scenery. So I've added in a floor and a couple of cubes floating around the player on each side so that you can see what's happening when you rotate the camera rig or scale. You can see them get bigger or smaller, because just having a skybox in the background, it doesn't really give you a clear idea of what's going on and knowing if your project's working. Anyway, now getting started, go over quickly the basic structure of this project. We're going to be creating and attaching a script to the camera rig, and also one that attaches to both the left and right controllers. The script attached to the camera rig, I'll just create those now. Go into create a scripts folder, C# script, and I'm going to call the first one controller inputs, and then another one, and call this one rig control. And now on the camera rig, we're going to attach rig control, and to the left and right controllers, add controller input. So how this is going to work, most of what happens in this series is going to be done through the rig control. That's where all the work of actually moving the camera rig and scaling it and rotating it around. But for it to happen, it has to know where the hands are as they're pressing the grip button, so that's what we'll be using. And has to know where they are, whether they're pressing a button, and that information's going to come to it through the controller input scripts. So let's get started on controller input. So I'm going to start with some fairly boilerplate commands that you would use anytime you're trying to get input through SteamVR. You don't need to understand all that's going to happen here. Just follow along, and you can cut and paste it for whatever other project you use it for. I'll try to explain as best as I can what's going on, or at least in terms of how to use it. So first, to create a private variable called SteamVR tracked object, and I'll just call it tracked obj. Now I'm going to create a public SteamVR controller dot device and call it device. And next, I'm going to create a serialized field, game object, left controller, right controller. Don't worry about these just yet, we'll be using that later. Another serialized field, and rig control, call this one CameraRig. Okay, and this variable here is how we're going to access our other script in order to send data to it. This serialized field, if any of you haven't seen that before, it's basically a way of having a private variable to which you can assign in the inspector. Sometimes it's useful to be able to assign objects in the inspector, but that variable doesn't actually need to be public, where public means that other scripts can modify it, and it's best not to do that when you don't really need to, because it's just good coding practice. The converse of that, by the way, just as a little bit of a tangent, I can use hide in inspector if I want a variable to be public, that is, it can be modified by other scripts, but I don't want it cluttering up the inspector. Anyway, that's not the case here. This one is good to be visible, and I want it to be public. All right, next, continuing on some of our boilerplate stuff, which is get tracked obj equals get component SteamVR tracked object. Okay. And this is what allows this variable to be private. We could just as easily have made this a public variable, assigned it in the inspector, and not bothered to assign it on the start. Let's make sure that's correctly spelled. I like to keep things out of the inspector that don't need to be, just because it's one less thing to forget. All right, next in update, have device equals SteamVR controller dot input and int, this is a typecast, tracked object dot index. All right, we'll stop there for now, and I'm going to assign these left and right controllers. All right, so on the left controller, bring in this one, assign the right controller to the right, and the camera rig to the camera rig. Do the same thing with the right controller. So put over the left and the right and the camera rig. Okay. Let's save early and often. Okay, next in update, we are going to see if this game object, so game object again is referring to the object to which this script is attached, equals left controller, and else if game object equals right controller. So inside these braces, I'm going to put in everything that happens for the left controller here is everything that happens with the right controller. Again, it's nice and divided up. The way I'm going to be running this is to use the grip buttons for all these camera rig controls. So I'm going to get that by going to if device.getPress SteamVR controller dot button mask dot grip, and then in here is everything that happens when the player presses the grip button with their left controller. If I wanted this to be trigger, then I just write trigger there, but I'm going to use the grips. And speaking of which, I'm going to put this same code in here because I'm using the grips on both hands. All right. So when player presses the left grip, if CameraRig dot left gripped equals false, CameraRig dot reset move. I'll actually write these functions and variables in the CameraRig script in a moment. So if this doesn't make sense, just follow along. Left. All right, let's take a look at this for a moment. This is going to throw errors now because I haven't actually defined these yet. I'll do that next. But the way I'm structuring this code is with controller input. I want to just get in and out of it as quickly as possible. It's necessary in order to figure out what the player is doing, what buttons they're pressing, and where their hands are. But once that's happened, it just calls functions, sets what variables it needs to, and then we're done. And all the actual work happens in those other scripts. The reason for that, the way I'm structuring it that way, is basically it's very easy to let your controller input script get really bloated because lots of things happen when the player presses inputs, and you could kind of describe most of a game that way. And I don't like to put everything in one place. It gets very unwieldy. Which in this particular project it might not be a very big deal, but if you were having a much bigger project and like lots of things happened, you could have this one script, even in this fashion, calling a bunch of different methods and variables in other scripts. And if that functionality was also here in addition to the calls, then it would get crazy. The other reason I like to keep my controller input script as minimal as possible is because these SteamVR controller commands are specific to SteamVR, and if I was to use something other than the Vive, like I was to use some very Oculus specific commands, I would need to rewrite all of this with different commands for the Oculus. And so if as much of my code as possible is not dependent on SteamVR specific things, then it becomes much easier to develop in a cross-platform fashion. Anyway, okay, so I'll just finish this here. Okay, so let's see. So, and then if they're not pressing the grip, then CameraRig dot left gripped equals false. For the right controller is going to be very similar. So I'll just copy this code, paste it here. It doesn't quite line up. Okay, and instead of left gripped, it's going to be right gripped. Right gripped and right gripped. Okay, now let's actually define the, let's get into our rig control script. All right, so let's declare some variables. First, public bool left gripped, right gripped. Okay. So again, if in case it's not clear, the way this worked is when the player presses the grip button, and then this variable over in rig control will be set to true or false, depending on what it is, but depending on how it's assigned in these commands. Okay, and we'll keep the start and update. I'm just going to go ahead and create a public void reset move. I'll actually fill this out later. I'm just going to create the method so that this red text goes away and removes those console errors. Okay, now in update, and we can get rid of that unnecessary text. If left gripped and right gripped scale rig and rotate rig. So this is just a little bit of user interface here. When the player is gripping both the left and right controllers, that's when they're going to be able to scale and rotate. So scale is grip with both hands, move your hands apart or together. Rotate is grip with both hands and then just move them in a circle. Else, if left gripped or right gripped, move rig. And so when the player grabs with one hand, whether it's the left or the right, doesn't matter, and then they pull, then they drag themselves along. And that's how the move rig script is going to work. Let's just set those up to remove the console errors. Right. And oh, right. And these will need to be just a void function to each of these, so Unity knows that it isn't returning anything. Let's see, this script is not going to need the start function. Now, if we want to test this, we can just say debug log, let's see, scaling rig, debug.log, rotating rig, and move rig, debug.log. This is totally optional, by the way, just a little bit of proof of concept here. Alright, so how this should work is, variables are updated by the controllers, and then this update function calls the appropriate functions based on which buttons are being pressed. Nothing will actually happen, the rig won't move around or anything. But let's see if this works. Alright. Save. Run the scene. Make sure there's no errors. Good to catch them early. Okay, so right now I'm not pressing either of the buttons, and so nothing is happening. Let's see, I'm just gonna press the right, and yes, it says it's moving rig. Press just the left alone, and more moving rig. I'm going to collapse these, make it easier to see. Now I press both, and it's moving, it's scaling and rotating the rig. They both go up at the same time. So far, so good. Alright, that's going to be it for this video. Just kind of setting up some of the basics and the structure of the rest of this project. And the next video will be getting into the move rig functionality and getting that actually working. A video after that, scaling, and then finally rotating, approaching these in order of difficulty. Thanks for watching. If you found this tutorial useful, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to support me and see more videos like this, I recently published my first VR game, Will-O-Wisp VR, on the Steam store. It's a lot of fun, a very physically active sword fighting game that makes full use of the Vive's room scale feature. The full version is $5, but there is also a free demo if you just want to try it out. I have included the link in the description, so if that interests you, go check it out. Until next time, I'm Will Patillo, signing out.